In 1945, the wealthiest colony on Earth suddenly discovered that every single coin in its treasury had been quietly drained to save the very empire that enslaved it. India had financed the most expensive war in human history, and then received absolutely nothing in return, except starvation, poverty, and a mountain of broken promises. This is the story of how the British Empire committed the largest financial theft in recorded history, and then made sure the entire world forgot it ever happened. Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. To understand how Britain bankrupted India, you first need to understand what India actually looked like before the Second World War shattered absolutely everything in 1939. India at that time was not a poor country by any honest measure. It was a land of vast agricultural wealth, thriving textile mills, and enormous mineral reserves. For decades before the war, Indian raw materials had been flowing to Britain at prices set entirely by London, not by any fair or open market. Cotton, jute, tea, iron ore, and countless other precious resources were extracted from Indian soil and then shipped across the ocean to fuel British factories. But what happened during the Second World War took this extraction to an entirely different level, a level that would leave India permanently and deeply scarred. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, it also made a decision that would change the fate of 400 million Indian people forever. Without consulting a single Indian leader or any elected representative, Britain simply dragged India into the war and announced that India was now fighting Germany too. Indian soldiers were immediately pulled into the British military machine. Indian factories were converted to produce weapons, and Indian farms were commanded to feed Allied troops. Over the next 6 brutal years, India would send 2.5 million of its young men to fight in a war that had absolutely nothing to do with them. These soldiers fought bravely in North Africa, in Italy, in Southeast Asia, and in the Middle East, bleeding and dying on battlefields thousands of miles from home. But the soldiers were only part of this tragic story, because the real weapon that Britain extracted from India was not manpower, but money and raw materials. Britain needed everything that India could produce. It needed steel for its tanks, cotton for uniforms, leather for boots, and food for millions of hungry soldiers. And so the British government created a system that allowed it to take all of these valuable resources from India without ever actually paying for them in real terms. This system was called the sterling balance arrangement, and it was perhaps the most clever financial trick any empire has ever played on a colonized nation. Here is how it worked in simple terms that anyone can understand, because the British deliberately made it confusing so that nobody would notice what was really happening. When Britain took goods from India, instead of paying in gold or actual currency, it simply credited the amount to a special account held inside London banks. India could not touch this money, India could not spend this money, and India could not convert this money into any other currency or withdraw it as gold. The money sat trapped in British banks, earning very low interest, while Britain used the actual physical goods to fight its war and feed its own people. Think of it this way. Imagine your neighbor takes your car, your furniture and all your food, and then hands you a piece of paper saying, "I owe you." And then that neighbor tells you that you cannot cash that piece of paper until he personally decides the time is right, which might actually be never. That is exactly what Britain did to India, on a scale so enormous that it is genuinely difficult for the human mind to fully comprehend its true size. By 1945, India had accumulated sterling balances worth approximately 1.3 billion British pounds, which in today money would be valued at well over $80 billion. India was suddenly one of the largest creditors in the entire world, but it was a creditor that could not collect even a single penny of what it was owed. The British government froze these balances completely and imposed strict rules that prevented India from ever using its own money to buy goods or invest in development. Meanwhile, the devastating human cost of this financial arrangement was becoming visible in the most horrifying way imaginable across the suffering Indian subcontinent. In 1943, while Indian food was being shipped overseas to feed British and Allied soldiers, a catastrophic famine suddenly struck the eastern province of Bengal. Rice prices skyrocketed violently as food supplies vanished from local markets, and millions of desperate Bengali families found themselves unable to afford even one single meal a day. Historians estimate that between 2 million and 3 million innocent people perished in the Bengal Famine of 1943, one of the worst humanitarian disasters of that entire century. Mothers watched helplessly as their children slowly wasted away. Entire villages were wiped from existence, and the streets of Calcutta were lined with the bodies of the starved. And yet during this very same horrifying period, India continued to export food, continued to export raw materials, and continued to finance the British war machine without any interruption. When desperate reports about the famine finally reached London, the response from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was shockingly cold and utterly devoid of any human compassion whatsoever. Churchill reportedly asked that if the famine was truly so severe, then why had Mahatma Gandhi not yet perished? A remark revealing his complete contempt for Indian lives. Urgent requests for emergency food shipments to starving Bengal were denied, diverted, or deliberately delayed, while grain continued flowing from Indian ports to British military bases around the world. The famine was not simply a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe, deliberately created by wartime policies that prioritized British military needs over Indian civilian survival and dignity. But the Bengal famine was only the most visible wound, because beneath the surface the entire Indian economy was being systematically hollowed out to serve the war effort. Indian industries that had been growing steadily before the war were now entirely devoted to military production, manufacturing goods that India itself would never use or benefit from. The Tata Steel plant in Jamshedpur was producing steel for Allied weapons. Textile mills across Bombay were weaving millions of military uniforms, and Indian railways carried only war cargo. All of this enormous production was being paid for with those same frozen sterling balances, nothing more than numbers on a ledger in London that India could never access. Inflation inside India exploded dangerously as the British printed more and more Indian rupees to pay for local war expenses without ever backing them with real goods or gold. The prices of basic daily necessities doubled and then tripled. Ordinary Indian families who had been reasonably comfortable before the war now found themselves pushed into desperate, grinding poverty. The British government, sitting comfortably in London, was fully aware of what was happening, but viewed Indian suffering as an entirely acceptable price for winning the war. In the grand halls of power at Westminster, politicians debated strategy and celebrated victories, while 400 million Indians quietly bore the crushing financial burden of a conflict they never chose. Indian political leaders, including Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose, spoke out passionately against this systematic exploitation, but their voices were completely drowned out by the noise of war. Nehru publicly called the sterling balance system a sophisticated form of financial slavery, a mechanism carefully designed to drain India completely dry while maintaining an illusion of fair compensation. And Nehru was absolutely right about everything, because the raw numbers tell a devastating story that becomes impossible to argue with once you finally see them clearly. India contributed more resources to the Allied war effort than any other colony or dominion in the entire British Empire, more than Australia, Canada, and South Africa combined. Indian soldiers fought heroically and made ultimate sacrifices at the Battle of Monte Cassino, at the Siege of Imphal, at El Alamein, and across the deadly jungles of Burma. Over 87,000 Indian soldiers lost their precious lives during the Second World War, and another 34,000 were seriously wounded fighting for a freedom that did not include their own. The Indian contribution to Allied victory was so absolutely enormous that many respected historians now firmly argue the Allies simply could not have won the war without India. Yet when the war finally ended in 1945, and wild celebrations erupted across London and New York, not a single voice mentioned the 400 million Indians who made victory possible. There were no victory parades for Indian soldiers on the streets of London, no monuments built in their eternal honor, and no gratitude expressed for their extraordinary sacrifice. Instead, what India received after the war was essentially a bill. Not a bill for money owed to India, but a bill for the supposed privilege of participating. Britain actually argued with a straight face that it had generously provided military protection to India during the war, and therefore India should not expect full repayment at all. This argument was truly breathtaking in its arrogance. Britain had forcibly dragged India into the war without any consent, and then demanded that India feel grateful for being dragged in. The massive sterling balances became the subject of intense and bitter negotiations between Britain and India in the difficult years following the end of the war. Britain held all the real power in these discussions because the money was physically sitting in British banks and Britain alone controlled all the rules governing its release. The British negotiating strategy was brutally simple. Delay for as long as humanly possible, pay back as little as possible, and let inflation quietly destroy the real value. And that is precisely what happened over the following years. The real purchasing power of the sterling balances was steadily and silently eaten away by relentless British inflation. By the time India was finally allowed to access small portions of its own money, the £1.3 billion had become worth only a tiny fraction of its original value. It was the perfect crime executed in plain sight. Britain had taken real goods, real food, real minerals, and real human lives, and paid with money that slowly became worthless. The distinguished economist Utsa Patnaik has carefully calculated that Britain systematically drained approximately $45 trillion from India over the entire brutal colonial period from 1765 to 1947. The wartime sterling balance scandal was simply the final devastating chapter of this centuries-long extraction, the last great heist before Britain was finally forced to leave India. But by 1947, the damage had already been permanently done. India entered its hard-won independence as one of the poorest nations on earth, completely stripped of its wealth. The India that the British abandoned in August 1947 bore absolutely no resemblance to the prosperous and magnificent land that British traders had first encountered 3 centuries earlier. Life expectancy at the moment of independence was a heartbreaking 32 years. Literacy rates were below 20%, and millions lacked access to even clean drinking water. The civilization that had once proudly produced 25% of total global economic output now accounted for less than 3%, a collapse that was entirely and deliberately man-made. The frozen sterling balances played a crucial role in this devastating economic collapse because they represented enormous wealth that India had legitimately earned but was never permitted to use. Imagine what India could have accomplished with $80 billion in today's terms. It could have built hospitals, schools, modern railways, factories, and vital infrastructure across the entire subcontinent. Instead, that staggering fortune sat frozen and untouchable in London, while Indian children continued dying from preventable diseases and Indian farmers could not grow enough food for survival. The profound injustice of the sterling balance system was certainly not lost on Indian leaders who raised this painful issue repeatedly and forcefully in the years following independence. But Britain possessed a powerful weapon in every single one of these difficult discussions, the direct threat that economic isolation would follow if India pushed its demands too aggressively. India desperately needed continued access to British markets, British industrial technology, and British diplomatic support within the newly formed United Nations, leaving India with no real bargaining power. The final painful settlement of the sterling balances was deliberately spread across many long years, with India receiving only small installments worth progressively less with each year that passed. Some outraged historians have since called this arrangement the longest-running financial fraud in all of modern history, a theft so vast and slow, that almost nobody even noticed. But this story does not end with just the money itself, because the deep psychological impact of the sterling balance scandal shaped India profoundly for many generations after independence. Indian economic planners became deeply and understandably suspicious of all foreign financial systems and chose to build a closed, self-reliant economy rather than ever trust outsiders with Indian wealth again. This fundamental decision, born directly from the deep trauma of British financial exploitation, would shape all Indian economic policy for the next 4 decades until liberalization finally arrived in 1991. The persistent fear of being cheated again and having national wealth drained away by foreign powers became a defining and dominant feature of Indian economic thinking throughout the 20th century. And honestly, who could possibly blame them for that fear? When the last time India had trusted a foreign power with its finances, the result was famine and total impoverishment. The sterling balance scandal also reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how the great wars of the 20th century were actually financed behind the scenes using colonial wealth. Every single bullet fired by a British soldier, every tank that rolled across a European battlefield, and every bomber that flew over Berlin was partially paid for by Indian labor. The famous factories of Birmingham and Manchester could never have produced their weapons without a constant river of Indian steel, Indian cotton, and Indian raw materials flowing in. The brave British soldier who helped liberate Europe was wearing boots crafted from Indian leather, eating rations grown on Indian soil, and carrying weapons forged from Indian iron ore. This is the deeply hidden cost of empire that the official history books published in London still do not teach. The price paid entirely by colonized people across the globe. When British politicians today speak so proudly about winning the Second World War, they conveniently never mention that their glorious victory was substantially built on stolen Indian wealth. The grand monuments standing across London celebrate British courage and sacrifice, but nowhere on any of them will you find even one word acknowledging that India financed the war. This deliberate and systematic erasure of the Indian contribution from official history is absolutely not accidental. It is carefully maintained silence designed to protect comfortable national myths. The uncomfortable truth is that Britain simply could not have survived the Second World War without India. Not just Indian soldiers, but Indian money, Indian food, and Indian materials. Without those enormous sterling balances quietly propping up the crumbling British economy, London itself would have faced total bankruptcy long before the guns of war finally fell silent. This is precisely why the sterling balance scandal matters so deeply, not merely as a historical footnote, but as a fundamental truth about how empires really operate behind their flags. Empires throughout history do not merely take territory and human labor, they systematically extract wealth on a scale so immense that colonized nations may never fully recover from it. India stands today as living and undeniable proof of this harsh reality. A civilization that ranked among the richest on earth before colonization and among the poorest when colonizers departed. The sterling balances represented the final deep wound inflicted on India, the very last extraction of wealth from a land that had already sacrificed everything to an ungrateful empire. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the entire world celebrated freedom and a fresh beginning. But for India, the nightmare was only entering its most painful and bitter chapter. Britain had won its war against tyranny abroad, while simultaneously practicing its own devastating form of tyranny against 400 million people trapped under colonial rule back in India. The frozen sterling balances worth 1.3 billion British pounds sat locked inside the vaults of the Bank of England like a stolen inheritance that the rightful owner could never claim. And now Britain faced a terrifying dilemma of its own, because the war had completely shattered the British economy and London itself was drowning in catastrophic levels of national debt. Britain owed money not just to India, but to Egypt, to Iraq, to Australia, and to dozens of other nations that had contributed resources during the long and costly conflict. The total British war debt had reached a staggering £21 billion, an amount so enormous that it threatened to completely destroy the British economy for generations to come. And here is where the story becomes truly infuriating. Because instead of honoring its massive debts, Britain went looking for a powerful friend to help it escape paying altogether. That powerful friend was the United States of America, which had emerged from the war as the wealthiest and most dominant economic force the modern world had ever seen. In 1946, Britain negotiated the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, borrowing $3.75 billion from the United States at a very low interest rate to rebuild its shattered post-war economy. American negotiators, led by the influential diplomat William Clayton, actually pressured Britain to settle its sterling balance debts fairly, recognizing that colonial nations had been systematically cheated. But Britain skillfully maneuvered around every single piece of American pressure, arguing that releasing the sterling balances too quickly would trigger hyperinflation and collapse the entire global financial system. This argument was deliberately exaggerated to create fear, because Britain understood perfectly well that frightened allies would always choose stability over justice for colonized peoples far away. The famous British economist John Maynard Keynes played a central role in these critical financial discussions, and his personal views on the sterling balances were absolutely shocking. Keynes privately argued that Britain should not feel morally obligated to repay India at all, because India had received military protection during the war as supposed fair compensation. This was the twisted logic of empire speaking through one of the most celebrated intellectual minds in all of Western economic history, a logic that treated theft as generosity. Keynes essentially argued that India should feel grateful for having its wealth confiscated, because that confiscation had been carried out under the noble banner of fighting fascism in Europe. It was as though a burglar had broken into your home, stolen everything you owned, and then demanded that you thank him because he used your belongings to help his neighbors. Meanwhile, in India, the devastating economic consequences of wartime financial exploitation were becoming more painfully visible with every single passing month after the guns finally went silent. Millions of returning Indian soldiers who had bravely fought for the British Empire came home to discover that there were no jobs, no pensions, and no meaningful support waiting. These decorated war heroes were simply abandoned and forgotten. Men who had bled on foreign battlefields, now begging on the dusty streets of their own impoverished villages and towns. The massive wartime inflation that Britain had deliberately created inside India continued to ravage ordinary Indian families long after the bombs had stopped falling across Europe and Asia. Food prices remained painfully high, industrial goods were scarce, and the basic infrastructure of daily life, including roads, hospitals, and clean water systems, had completely deteriorated beyond recognition. When India finally gained its long-awaited independence on August 15, 1947, the new nation inherited an economy that had been methodically stripped down to its bare and broken bones. The first finance minister of independent India was the brilliant Shamakam Chetty, who immediately confronted the enormous challenge of retrieving the frozen sterling balances from a reluctant Britain. Chetty travelled personally to London to negotiate the release of Indian money and encountered what he later described as a wall of polite British refusal disguised behind endless bureaucratic delays. Every meeting produced promises, and every promise produced another meeting, while the real value of the sterling balances continued to silently shrink under the relentless weight of British inflation. Britain had perfected this strategy over centuries of colonial administration, the art of saying yes while meaning no, and the technique of agreeing in principle while blocking all action. The newly independent Indian government found itself caught in a devastating trap. It desperately needed the sterling balance money to feed its starving population and build a functioning modern economy. But pressing Britain too aggressively risked destroying the fragile diplomatic relationship that India needed to maintain its place and credibility in the rapidly changing post-war international order. And so India accepted a painfully slow schedule of repayments that stretched across decades, receiving small amounts at irregular intervals while inflation continuously eroded every single payment received. Historians who have studied the final settlement estimates that India eventually recovered less than 1/3 of the real purchasing power of what it was originally owed by Britain. 2/3 of the actual value simply evaporated into thin air, consumed by inflation, absorbed by fees, destroyed by unfavorable exchange rates, and swallowed by deliberate British financial engineering. To put this enormous loss into proper perspective, the stolen portion alone could have funded the complete construction of modern highways connecting every major city across the entire Indian subcontinent. It could have built thousands of fully equipped hospitals, hundreds of modern universities, and provided clean drinking water to every single village in a nation of 350 million people. Instead, that vast fortune disappeared quietly into the British financial system, where it helped rebuild London, fund the British welfare state, and maintain British living standards during difficult post-war years. The beautiful National Health Service that British citizens are so rightly proud of today was partially funded by money that rightfully belonged to starving Indian mothers and their dying children. The elegant post-war reconstruction of British cities, including the rebuilding of bombed neighbourhoods across London, was made possible in part by wealth systematically extracted from Indian soil and Indian labour. This is not speculation, more emotional exaggeration. It is documented financial history that anyone with patience and determination can verify through official British Treasury records held in national archives. The numbers do not lie even when governments deliberately choose to. And the numbers tell a story of one of the greatest wealth transfers in the entire recorded history of humanity. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire sterling balance scandal is not the theft itself, but the almost total silence that has surrounded it for nearly 80 years. Ask the average British citizen today about the sterling balances, and you will receive a completely blank stare. This critical chapter of history simply does not exist in British education. British schoolchildren learn extensively about the heroism of the Second World War, about the brave pilots of the Battle of Britain, and about the glorious beaches of Normandy on D-Day. But they learn absolutely nothing about the Indian soldiers who fought alongside them, nothing about the Indian resources that equipped them, and nothing about the Indian wealth that financed them. This deliberate historical amnesia is not simply an innocent oversight, it is a carefully constructed national narrative designed to preserve a comforting myth of pure British self-reliance and heroism. The myth says that brave little Britain stood alone against the full terrifying might of Nazi Germany and won through sheer courage, determination, and unbreakable British fighting spirit. The truth is that Britain never truly stood alone at all. Behind those brave British soldiers stood hundreds of millions of colonial subjects whose forced contributions made British survival physically possible. India alone contributed more soldiers to the Allied cause than all the other British colonies combined, and India alone financed a larger portion of the war than most Allied nations. When Winston Churchill declared that the Second World War was the finest hour of the British people, he was conveniently erasing the colonial peoples who made that finest hour achievable. And this erasure continues powerfully today through museums, textbooks, films, and television programs that celebrate British wartime heroism while completely ignoring the colonial foundations upon which it was built. The sterling balance scandal also carries profound lessons about the fundamental nature of international financial systems and how powerful nations routinely exploit weaker ones through monetary manipulation alone. Britain did not need to send armed soldiers to loot Indian temples during the Second World War. It simply needed accountants, bankers, and financial agreements to achieve exactly the same result. The weapons of colonial extraction had evolved dramatically from the crude physical plunder of earlier centuries into sophisticated financial instruments that could drain an entire nation completely dry without firing a shot. This evolution from physical plunder to financial exploitation is one of the most important and least understood transitions in the entire history of colonialism and imperial domination across the globe. And many respected scholars argue convincingly that this same pattern of financial exploitation continues operating in the modern world today under different names and through different but equally effective mechanisms. When powerful nations today impose unfair trade agreements, manipulate global currency markets, or trap developing countries in cycles of unpayable debt, they are following a blueprint that Britain perfected. The sterling balance system was in many meaningful ways a prototype for the modern mechanisms of financial control that continue to keep formerly colonized nations locked in persistent economic disadvantage. Understanding this painful historical pattern is absolutely essential for anyone who genuinely wants to comprehend why the global distribution of wealth remains so dramatically and persistently unequal today. India did not become a poor country because of any inherent failure of its people, its culture, or its economic capacity. India was deliberately made poor through centuries of calculated colonial extraction. The poverty that haunted India throughout the second half of the 20th century was not a natural condition. It was a manufactured outcome produced by specific policies designed to benefit a distant empire. And the sterling balance scandal of the Second World War was the single most devastating of all those extractive policies. The final grand theft committed at the very moment of departure. It was as though a departing thief had swept through the house one final time, grabbing everything of value from every room before walking out the door for the very last time. But history also reveals something truly extraordinary about the Indian spirit. Because despite this catastrophic financial devastation, India somehow managed to slowly and painfully rebuild itself from absolute nothing. The early decades after independence were undeniably harsh and difficult, with widespread poverty, food shortages, and the enormous challenge of governing the most diverse nation on the entire planet. Yet, India endured, India survived, and India eventually began to grow, developing its own technology sector, building world-class educational institutions, and nurturing a vibrant democratic system against all expectations. The India of today, with its booming economy, its advanced space program, and its global technological influence, would be completely unrecognizable to the desperate, starving millions of 1947. This remarkable transformation represents one of the most incredible recovery stories in the entire sweep of human civilization. A wounded giant slowly rising back to its feet after centuries of exploitation. But the scars of the sterling balance scandal and the broader colonial financial extraction remain deeply embedded in the economic DNA of the Indian nation even in the present moment. India still struggles with massive income inequality, inadequate public infrastructure in rural areas, and persistent poverty that traces its roots directly back to the systematic wealth extraction of the colonial era. The billions of dollars that were drained through the sterling balance system could have provided the foundation for a completely different India, a wealthier, healthier, and more equitable nation from its very beginning. Instead, India was forced to begin its independent journey with essentially nothing, building from the ground up, while Britain used Indian wealth to construct its comfortable post-war prosperity across the English Channel. The contrast between post-war Britain and post-war India tells the entire story with devastating clarity. One nation rebuilding in relative comfort, while the other nation starved in terrible and unnecessary darkness. And yet the conversation about colonial reparations remains one of the most fiercely resisted and deliberately avoided topics in all of international diplomacy, even now in the 21st century. Britain has never formally acknowledged the full devastating scale of its financial exploitation of India, never offered a meaningful official apology, and certainly never proposed any form of financial compensation. When the topic is raised in British political circles, it is typically dismissed as ancient history, as though the deliberate impoverishment of hundreds of millions of people deserves no serious reflection. But the effects of that ancient history are still painfully alive today in every Indian village that lacks a proper hospital, in every Indian child who cannot access quality education. History does not simply end because powerful nations find it uncomfortable to remember. The consequences of historical injustice echo through generations, affecting the lives of people who were never even born. The sterling balance scandal also raises deeply uncomfortable questions about the moral cost of victory in the Second World War, questions that most historians still prefer to completely avoid. We rightfully celebrate the defeat of fascism as one of the greatest moral achievements in all of human history, a triumph of freedom over tyranny and of justice over oppression. But we rarely ask at whose expense that magnificent victory was achieved, whose lives were sacrificed, whose wealth was stolen, and whose suffering was deliberately ignored to make that victory possible. The Indian people paid an enormous share of the true cost of defeating fascism, and received virtually nothing in return, not even the basic dignity of historical acknowledgement and recognition. This uncomfortable truth does not diminish the genuine heroism of those who fought against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Their courage and sacrifice remain truly beyond any adequate measure of praise. But it does demand that we expand our understanding of who actually won that war and whose shoulders carry the invisible and unacknowledged weight of that extraordinary global victory. The Second World War was not won solely by the nations whose flags flew over the victory celebrations in London, Washington, and Moscow in the triumphant summer of 1945. It was won equally by millions of unnamed colonial subjects from India, from Africa, and from across the Caribbean, whose forced contributions remain almost completely invisible in every official historical account. These invisible soldiers, invisible workers, and invisible financial contributors deserve a permanent place in the global story of the Second World War, a place that has been deliberately denied to them. The sterling balance scandal is ultimately a story about visibility, about whose suffering matters, whose contributions count, and whose sacrifices are considered worthy of remembrance by the powerful nations of the world. And in the end, it is a story about the fundamental difference between winning a war and achieving true justice, because one nation won the war while another lost absolutely everything. So remember the shocking truth we began with, that the wealthiest colony on earth discovered every single coin in its treasury had been quietly drained to save the very empire that enslaved it. That truth is not just a historical fact from the distant past, it is a living and breathing reality that continues to shape the relationship between former colonial powers and their former colonies today. The sterling balances were not just numbers trapped inside London bank accounts. They represented the stolen futures of hundreds of millions of human beings who deserve so much more from history. Every frozen pound represented food that should have fed a hungry Indian child, medicine that should have healed a sick Indian mother, and education that should have lifted an Indian family. The real tragedy of the sterling balance scandal is not simply the money that was lost. It is the countless human lives and infinite human potential that were permanently sacrificed along with it. This is the hidden cost of empire that polished textbooks and grand museum exhibits will never honestly show you. The human wreckage left behind when powerful nations decide their survival matters more. But knowledge is the first step toward true justice, because once you understand what really happened, you can never again look at the comfortable myths of empire the same way. The story of how Britain bankrupted India to fund the Second World War is not a story about the past. It is a warning about the present and a lesson for the future. It reminds us that behind every great victory, there are hidden victims. Behind every wealthy nation, there are impoverished ones. And behind every glorious history, there are painful truths deliberately left untold. Now you know the truth that was hidden from history for nearly 80 long years. The truth that one of the greatest empires ever built was funded by the greatest theft ever committed. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons, and I will help you discover them.